Hello, everybody. My name is Melissa Lafara, and I am so honored to be here today and have been invited onto Stormy Grace's YouTube Academy. And so I've been so jazzed to give this presentation ever since I heard about her whole project, when the Kickstarter started last year. And so time has flown, and here we are. And so today, this is a pre-recorded presentation that is obviously going live on YouTube, but just so you know, I will be in the chat. So if you have any questions about the material that is presented here today, feel free to ask in the chat, and I will be there on hand to answer any questions. And it is a beautiful Monday in the skies, right? We have a Memorial Day here in the US. And most importantly, we have the sun making a conjunction to the North Node in Gemini today. And Gemini is a sign of learning, and the sun is a point of awareness. And there's always that destiny and that kind of forward illumination that happens when a planet meets the North Node. So I'm very honored to have my presentation be coinciding with this meeting in the sky. So I hope that you get a lot from what I have to share here today. And so what is that even about? Well, my presentation is on rulership and dignity. So let's go ahead and I will share my screen and get our presentation started. All right, rulership and dignity. And I just love the image of the crown and a throne, and just the remembering that planets have their own dignity. They have places where they are dignified and places where they might have some issues a little bit more. And so that's what we're going to uncover and unpack here today. And for some of you, this might be a completely new, concept, but it is a very important one in astrology to get the most out of your delineations. And if you already work with rulership and the concept, hopefully there's going to be something for you in this presentation as well, and maybe a different way to look at it. Because I think our perception of dignity and debility and everything in between is very important on how we share that, how we look at our own charts with it, and how we might share that with clients if you are planning to practice astrology in a professional setting. So what is rulership in astrology? Well, number one, we got to know that each planet has dominion over particular signs of the zodiac. So, the sun has a place of dominion. Jupiter has a place of dominion, actually has two. All the planets, or at least all the classical planets, the sun through Saturn, all have a particular sign or two signs that they have dominion over. And we'll discuss more of what that actually means as the presentation goes on. Now, that being said, if a planet is not in its own sign, that means that it must look to, and you're probably going to hear me say that a few times in this presentation here today, it has to look to its ruling planet to help with its affairs, because it can't get there directly. So basically what we have here is this host-guest relationship. And so it's sort of like if we don't have a planet in its own sign, we have, it's almost like we're wanting to do something with that particular planet, or maybe we have a project, or, there's a wish or a desire or what have you. But that planet is going to have to confer with the boss, the host, so to speak, in order to get the working orders, in order to know how to go about things. And that, depending on the boss's level and dignity, that's going to dictate, once again, how well a planet functions for its natural significations. And so we'll dive in more to that. But this is the main thing I'm sharing here, is that by the end of this presentation, I want you to be in the habit of looking not only at a planet, because it's easy to be like, oh, Jupiter in Aries, it's one thing, but we have to look at its ruler too before we start, deciphering what that truly means. And that goes for angles too. It's not just planets. It's also the angles, like the ascendant, the descendant, the midheaven, and the IC. And so the ruling planet can also color the expression of the planet that it's under its rule. So, say we have a planet that is in a particular, in Aries, and its ruling planet is in Cancer. All of a sudden now we have this Aries Cancer blend. And so we'll talk about that. And also remember that planets can rule over other planets, but also houses. So we have planets that rule over houses, and we get a lot of insight into that area of life for ourselves or a client by looking at the planetary archetypes that are behind the houses, whether you're using whole signs like I do, or if you use quadrant systems and you're looking at house cusps. Either way, this, looking at what planet rules that house is very important. Now, another thing too is in modern astrology, you may also hear this concept as the dispositor when we talk about having a final dispositor in the chart. And so we'll look on that as well. So let us start off with the Thema Mundi chart, which is considered the birth chart of the world. And so the idea is that these were the position of all the planets at the time of, when the Earth, or when the universe was created. And so, this is speculation, I'm sure, but it is a really neat system and one that has checked out for me over the years. So, but this is where it all begins. This is its origin story, which is really the origin of the universe. And it's said that, at the birth of the universe, that Cancer was rising. And we have the moon there. And then it follows in order from the planets, from the moon to the sun in Leo, Mercury in Virgo, Venus in Libra, Mars in Scorpio, Jupiter in Sagittarius, and Saturn in Capricorn. And then it's fanned out on the other side, which you'll see here in a second. This also corresponds with the Egyptian New Year, because in the summer when the Nile floods, this summer is that solstice period, that Cancer period. And so there is this, and we think of Cancer as being that birthplace, that mother, so there is this initiating energy that comes from this place. And there are certain astrologers out there that believe that the natural rising sign of the zodiac actually is Cancer rather than Aries. But this is basically setting up our bigger scheme here and giving us a rhyme to the reason of what we're going to unpack, and why we will only be using the 7 classical planets, like I said before, as I come from the camp that when it comes to rulership, that the planets that we can't see with our naked eyes, like Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, they don't hold domicile. You can choose to use them over time if you feel it's right with your practice, because that is, practice, especially when it is partially intuitive, is very personal. So take what I give here today, but find your own wiggle room if it resonates with you. Okay, so here we have the symmetry of these planets in domicile. So once again, this is when planets are considered in their domicile, in their strength, in their dominion, when they are hosts in their own areas. And we see down at the bottom of the chart, we see the moon there in Cancer, and we see the sun in Leo. And then you'll notice as it fans out, it goes from Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And I'm a little ahead of myself. All right, so basically we have our 2 luminaries that start it. Just going back over this concept here, our 2 luminaries that start the chain, and then it continues on to both Mercury and ruling Gemini and Virgo, Venus ruling Taurus and Libra, Mars ruling Aries and Scorpio, Jupiter ruling Pisces and Sagittarius, and then Saturn at the far reaches of the universe ruling Aquarius and Capricorn. So basically, if we have any planets, in Aries, we're going to have to look to Mars. We got to see what Mars is doing. If it's not Mars in Aries, we have to look to its dominion. If we have a planet in Libra, we need to see what Venus is doing, because Venus is going to add more definition. Venus is going to be the host, and that planet is just a guest in Libra. If we have planets in Cancer, we need to know what the moon is doing. Where is its host in the chart? Now, of course, if we have, say, Jupiter in Sagittarius, that look no further. That planet is pure in expression and in its own domicile. And the host is at home, so to speak. So another way to look at this is to view it as from a symmetry that fans out from the two luminaries, as we've already kind of seen at the bottom with the sun and the moon there. But what it does is it sets up a scheme that is emanating from the divine masculine of the sun and the divine feminine of the moon. And so you'll see this night and day around, each of the around each of the signs. And so basically the sun and the moon only rule one sign, but all the rest of the signs, Mercury through Saturn, are going to rule two signs. And they're going to have a day domicile, and they're going to have a nighttime domicile. So basically our day domicile for Mercury is Gemini, where the night is Virgo. The night domicile for Venus is Taurus. The day is Libra. The night domicile for Mars is Scorpio. The day is Aries. The night domicile for Jupiter is Pisces, and the day is Sagittarius. The night domicile for Saturn is Capricorn, and the day is Aquarius. Now, when you get into sect, which I believe there's already been a presentation on that, I think, double check me on that, but there's plenty of information out there, and I'm sure there will be more presentations in this particular series that will deal with that. But that's an important part of delineating rulership as well, if they're in their daytime domicile or nighttime domicile. And we won't be quite getting into that here today, but just so you know, there is more depth to experience there. Okay, so this is basically the rule. Unless you have a planet in its own sign, that planet will need help from its ruler when acting out its agenda. So that's just a given, basically. And this is where astrology becomes complicated. But with complication brings details, and juicy details at that. So you wonder how people get down to really specifics with being able to read a planet's expression in a chart or a house's expression. It's through rulership and how these dignities work. So memorize these placements, put them under, put them in your pocket, be able to, if you can't recall them right now, that might be the first place to start, is just to commit these to memory so that it becomes second nature when you are looking at planets, and your eyes will start to do the dance of connection, basically. And also another thing to think about is to really get used to associating the signs with planets. So, if you have Gemini and Virgo planets, they are mercurial by nature. Just put that in your memory, that those are going to be very mercurial. If you have Taurus and Libra planets, they're Venusian by nature. Aries and Scorpio planets are going to be Martian by nature. Pisces and Sagittarius planets are Jupiterian by nature, and Aquarius and Capricorn planets are Saturnian by nature. So just, add that archetype behind whatever planet that might be. So let's look into the concept of dignity. And this pairs with rulership, but consider it a second layer with dignity. And so, what is dignity? Well, dignity is really the concept that all planets are not created I guess maybe not created equal, but not treated equal within their sign placements, because we just learned about the rulership scheme of the theme of Mundi chart. But really what it does is it's showing us how at home these planets are And depending on how at home they are is really going to dictate how, pure their expression might be. And so, all right, well, let's get in there. Now, this is a lovely chart that Chris Brennan put together, and you'll see some of the charts that I use, just the schemes that as our examples, like the Thema Mundi chart, I believe he created as well. Great resources. But as you can see from this table of planetary rulerships, that there are a lot of planetary rulerships. This is a complicated thing. But today we're only going to be focusing on the four best known, I guess we could say, that are more right up in your face. And so we're going to have the dignity placements, which are domicile and exaltation. And then we're going to be talking about the debility placements of adversity and depression, which this is considered being a loss of dignity in some way. And so adversity, you could hear that as detriment. You could hear that as exile. These are other common terms for it. Depression, you can hear that more often as fall, when a planet is in fall. So typically I would say that detriment and fall are pretty much the go-to words for these placements, but adversity and depression are more ancient terms around these concepts. Now, all these other things about triplicity lords, bounds and terms, decans and faces, we're not going to be covering those, but they do add a considerable layer to astrology. And if you want to dive into those more, I do recommend reading Demetra George's Ancient Astrology in Theory and Practice book, because she goes into it in great detail. So let's talk about these exaltations. And so we've looked at domiciles already, which is our first point of dignity, a planet being its own sign and being a host and really being pure in expression. Well, this is a second tier of dignity known as exaltations. And so once again, this is just good to memorize these placements so that you just know where they are. But this is another point when a planet is in what's considered a better spot to have purity of expression and to be lifted up in some way. And so the idea is that why are these positions in, exalted? Well, it's because they are in either a trine or a sextile from their original domicile position. So if it was a daytime planet, like the sun, Saturn, or Jupiter, its exaltation is in a trine to that position. If it is a nighttime planet like Venus, Mars, or the moon, then it's in a sextile relationship. And so here and that might sound a little complicated, but you can kind of see it more when we look at these schemes. So here we have, let's start with the sun, where we have the sun exalted in Aries. And we know that the domicile of the sun originates in Leo. And so this is a trine relationship. Let's go to another daytime planet of Jupiter. And so here we have Jupiter exalted in Cancer. And so here we have, actually, you know what? I'm just going to run through these right now in their positions, because I'm realizing Mercury is squaring Neptune and I'm getting ahead of myself. So I'm going to keep it simple. So let's start that over again, because, hey, no shame. Okay, so let's just go in order of these exalted positions, and just for memorization's shit's sake, let's not add too much complication to this, not during Neptune transits and Mercury stationing. So basically we have the sun exalted in Aries, we have the moon exalted in Taurus, we have Jupiter exalted in Cancer, we have Mercury exalted in Virgo, which is also a place of its domicile too. So Mercury, plays double duty in some places. We have Saturn exalted in Libra, and we have Mars exalted in Capricorn, and we have Venus exalted in Pisces. And so just commit these to memory and know that the planets are more pure and lifted up in these positions. Now let's talk about debilitated planets. But before we can talk about debilitated planets, we actually have to come back to the domiciles. And because the domiciles is really what sets up what is being debilitated, especially in the term of detriment planets, also known as exile or adversity. And so here we have our scheme again of we see our domiciles and when planets are at home and in their own sign. Well, detriments are when a planet is in the reverse position, or I guess we could say the opposition from where it is at home and where its domicile is. And so here we see an example with the sun if the sun in Aquarius, which is a Saturn, domicile, would be considered in its detriment there. Same with Saturn in Leo, where it's the sun's domicile, would be considered in its detriment there. And so, think of it this way, when they switch places like that, when the sun is in Saturn's sign, that natural warmth and brightness of the sun is being dampened by Saturn's coldness and darkness, right? There's the sun's the center of everything. Saturn's the far reaches and the limits and where the ancients thought that the universe ended in some way. So these are totally different expressions. And the same with Saturn in the sun sign in Leo. Its natural tendency of cold and dark and being those outer limits that that we can see with our eyes gets warmed and centralized at the heart of everything rather than being on the fringe or the edges. And so it really comes down to a comfort factor, is that these planets are not comfortable in these positions. If Saturn's out there in the darkness and far away and all being a wallflower and like walled off in some way, adding, a light on it and being like, that can feel a bit much. Or if you're trying to express yourself and be the center of everything with the sun, and then you have, Saturn's energies kind of beating down your back, that can be difficult there too. So you can see the discomfort that comes with these positions. Now, these are all the detriments in red, and really you'll see that they are just reversals or oppositions of each other. So, we're already saying that these planets are basically reversed from their lords. Lords is another term for hosts. And that we know that there's an extreme difference in their mode or function. So let's break it down in some more specifics, like the moon in Capricorn. Is that the moon in Capricorn, this is cold, this can be strict, this can be harsh boundaries, because of Saturn. And that is difficult for a free-flowing, emotional, nurturing, and giving nature of the moon. And so there can be a cutoff of feeling there. Maybe an emotional harshness or a reactivity that is more critical than it is tender and giving, like the moon might be. Or how about, looking at Jupiter being in detriment in the signs of Mercury, in both Gemini and Virgo there. Because Mercury is about that finite reasoning and logic, the bits and pieces that make up the whole, where Jupiter is more abstract and seeing the big picture and working in the realm of belief, not facts. And so it may struggle more with those details or, finding truth in data rather than, a belief around something. And Venus and Mars, this is classic. We can see how Venus in Mars's sign, when we have Venus in Aries there, or Venus in Scorpio, Mars is it can be harder to connect because Mars is very self-driven in its environment. It's more, it wants what it wants. It's independent in that way. And Venus is about connecting. So it can be harder in those positions. Or if Mars is in Venus's territory where it has its self-driven agenda, but if it's sitting there in Libra or in Taurus, when it, in signs that are concerned with compromising for others or keeping the peace in some way, it's going to be stirring the pot. And so it's just not comfortable there. And can be a little, disruptive at times in connection. So this is the idea of what we're talking about with detriment. Now, fall positions, which is also known as that depression we're talking about, are the reverse positions from the exaltations. And so we see, Saturn being in fall in Aries. We see Mercury being in fall in Pisces. We see Jupiter being in fall in Capricorn. We see the moon being in fall in Scorpio, the sun being in fall in Libra, Venus being in fall in Virgo, and Mars being in fall in Cancer. And so once again, we just have to memorize these placements. But if you memorize domiciles and you memorize exaltations, you're always going to be able to know the detriment positions and the fall positions, because they're always opposite. So that is kind of the scheme that we are working with here. Now, talking about fall planets, if we talk about exaltation planets getting lifted up in some way, like they're rising, they're not in domicile, they're not like just pure, but they have help where someone's like lifting them up on their shoulders and like, they're like, we've got you here. Well, that's the reversal of fall and in depression. And being depressed is there's like a divot, there's like an indent. And it doesn't mean it's necessarily psychological depression, although that can come in at times depending on the planet and the position. But there is the idea of like running into a divot. Think about when you kind of like might like kind of trip in a pothole a little bit and you stumble and you're like, or you stub your toe in some way. These might be kind of fall positions and what they might bring about planetarily speaking with those archetypes. And so the one thing we always have to remember with dignity versus debility is that planets in dignity or debility do not show morality. They don't. If you have a planet in dignity, it doesn't mean it's a good planet or you're a good person. Or if you have a debilitated planet, that you're a bad person, or that it does not mean that at all. So throw that concept out of the window, and anybody who wants to come at it from that, because there's people that have strong dignity in their charts where all their planets are dignified and they're a serial killer, versus debilitated planets, and these people are helping tons of other people and are like a true gift to this world. So morality has nothing to do with these positions. So it's not a moral judgment. A person's not good or bad depending on the positions. And it's not saying one planet is more virtuous than another. And it doesn't say that a debilitated planet necessarily shows weakness either. And so I just thought this cat was cute, and it might go with this concept or not, but like we don't know which way it's going, I guess is what I'm saying. So we can get certain things from dignity and debility, but we can't really tell, this kind of up or down or what direction it really goes in just by being like, oh, that planet's in this place, that planet's in that place. So let's cut out maybe that like stark thinking when it comes to dignity and debility. All right, so let's talk about dignity and the planets that get the keys, right? Well, dignity, once again, is planets in domicile or exaltation. So the planets that are in their own dominion or are in these exalted places from their dominion. And really, these planets are quite happy as they are in a natural environment, a natural fit for their environment. That's the number one thing to remember here, is that the planet is happy. It fits well where it is. It's either at home or it's in a very comfortable guest relationship. And so once again, it doesn't mean it's inherently good. What it does is it just shows a natural confidence and competence in that area. So some of the key words we might see with a dignified planet is confidence, certainty, competence in that area, a sureness, a capacity, a proficiency, a consistency. That's a very important one to remember. A suitability, comfortable, contented, secure. That's important too. Peace of mind, ease, these are these positions of dignity. And so what, we have to remember that, there's just consistency here. And so this is the thing, is that you might not actually see innovation or originality to the placement of a dignified planet, because they are excellent at working within the framework of what already exists for that planetary signification, right? They're not going to reinvent the wheel. They can just uphold what the wheel is because they're very strong with it. And so there is that consistency. And they don't really rely on anyone else because they are so confident and competent in their abilities in this area of life or this archetype, that they also, they might not want to listen to input from other people, or the self-direction can be so strong that there's really no getting around that. And so houses, remember, because houses are ruled by planets, houses that are ruled by planets in dignity usually have more consistency to them, where the person holds their own in these areas of life, or are frequently helped out or lifted up in the case of exaltation. And so, once again, domicile, this is the lord of the manor. This is rulership of resources. The resources are at your hand. They're at the ready. They're there. Exaltation, these planets get held in high esteem and honor. They're lifted up, they're elevated, they're respected by other people. They profit from benefactors, where someone just comes in their life and helps that planet rise above through the help of someone else. And so, this is important to think about. If we have, like, say, the seventh house of partnerships is ruled by a planet in domicile or in exaltation, chances are they're probably going to have a little more consistency with relationships, whether it is in like a fabulous marriage, or maybe they love being by themselves and that is their relationship, or they like, it doesn't have to be this storybook. We want to look at the sign that it's, exemplifying. But there can be more consistency in what that expression is. Same with career, maybe someone with a exalted or domicile planet ruling the house of career has an easier time there, or is more sure of what they want to create in the world, and their ability to have success, or what their idea of achievement is, and going for that straightforward. Because remember, at the end of the day, with dignity, there is a consistency there. There's a comfortable, there is a contentedness, there's a security, and there's a confidence. So let's talk about debility, and that's planets in detriment or fall. And so here we have this guy rolling that, like Sisyphus rolling that rock up the hill. And so these planets are more challenged as they are not suited for the environment they are in. Remember, because they are opposite of either the domicile or the exaltation of the planet's natural purity and rulership zone. And so even though they're not suited for their environment they're in, that doesn't mean that they're not successful or they can't be successful. I want to make that very clear straight away. They just might need to work harder and in innovative or unique ways. Remember, we're talking about dignity didn't have to reinvent the wheel. They could just go for it. It's pure, it goes. But debility, this is more about having to work around things and be very unique and come at things from different angles. And so you're going to find that some of the pioneers in given fields will have debilitated planets because they've had to do things outside of the box and come up with original solutions. The kind of, how did they do that results? Like, how did they, well, they probably didn't do it on the first go. It probably took a lot of, rearranging and reworking and all that. So let's look at some of the keywords of debility. So inconsistency, right? If dignity was consistency, debility, there's an inconsistency here. There might be an inefficiency. There could be deviation, insecurity, self-doubt, hesitancy, vacillation, fluctuation, dependency, reliance on something or someone, and a greater effort needed to overcome. And so here we are, we're seeing that debility can have a hard time holding up matters. Because it's shown that there's inconsistency or inefficiency. And this can be especially in the case when we go back to houses again, when houses are ruled by a debilitated planet. It doesn't mean that they can't rise up. It just means that there will always be changes in those areas at some point due to the fluctuation nature of that placement. Hence the need to get clever at times to move around obstacles and barriers. So just as I used the example before of the 7th house and the 10th house, say you have a debilitated planet, and this goes for any house, of course, ruling these areas, there's just going to be a different situation going on. There's going to be fluctuation. There'll be ups and downs, but it can be different depending on if it's detriment or fall. And so detriment is, when they're in the opposition of the domicile and their host zones, and this lack of comfort there, they might receive opposition to that planetary energy. There can be obstacles, hindrances, adversity, exile, not feeling at home. And I will say that a lot of times I notice that people will exile themselves when they have a planet in exile. It doesn't mean that the world necessarily rejects you or pulls away. You might feel that call within yourself, depending on the own planet, to exile and go as far away as possible, or it just gets so uncomfortable in a way that it's like better to like step back. And that's where that inconsistency comes from, and that vacillation or that self-doubt or that hesitancy. And so, just so you know, sometimes it's not the world that presents these situations. It's actually an inside job that is taking place. Now with fall, these planets are diminished or depressed in power. They're brought down. Things fall away from their life. Maybe they're humbled in some way or disparaged, or feeling a lack of respect or authority, or situations that lead to sorrow and distress. Keep trying to get the promotion, yet someone else always gets it before you get it, or something like that. And that planet in fall is like, it's just feeling that like it just keeps hitting that divot in some way. And so you have to find ways to go around it, and keep coming at it, maybe to get the thing that you desire, because it's not like it's not totally unattainable. It's just not going to be solid on first go. I guess, it's going to take a lot of push and pull and back and forth and ups and downs in order to get there. Now, what I will say is that I've noticed that people with planets in fall actually tend to help those that have little power or brought down in society in some way. If we're talking about like a social worker, because it's easier to define, it's easier to resonate with someone who's having a hard time if you yourself have had a hard time. You think of like AA sponsorships or something like that, and someone's been through the program, and then they end up helping others because they understand themselves. This is, so there, once again, there can be wonderful placements to these debilitated planets. It's just a different type of expression. So once again, keep in mind, debility equals inconsistency, deviation, discomfort in some way, and a greater effort in order to overcome. Water break. All right. So let's talk about dispositor chains. And I mentioned that earlier about this being kind of a modern term. And dispositor chains are, okay. So let's, what happens when a planet is ruled by a planet not in its own sign, right? We already see it go to one chain, but it can be much more complex than that. Because this means that there may be a simple, there might be a simple formula of one planet looking to another one, and that one's in its domicile, or it could be a much more complex planetary chain going on here. Because, say you have to confer with like 3 or more planets when a planet is trying to do its job until it gets to one in domicile. So it's kind of like it's passing the buck here, you know, like, here, you deal with this, or what do you have to say, or what do you have to say? And that can either be very powerful if you have a productive planetary flow, or it can be very challenging because the power to act actually gets lost through the decision-making process. Or what, you know, think about playing the telephone game where one planet whispers something to another one, and then it whispers something to another one, and then another one. And then before you know it, it's like a totally different intention or idea or feeling or, you know, approach, or which can be a wonderful thing. It just depends on how that's working. So, the picture here is actually the Mundane Dispositors for January 31st of 2020. And so if you look, you know, see, we had the sun in Aquarius, which had to look at Saturn, right? We had the moon in Taurus on this day, and it had to look to Venus, who had to look to Jupiter, who had to look to Saturn. Because of, you know, we saw that Venus at that time, so Venus is in Pisces, right? So that's a Jupiter placement. Jupiter was in Capricorn, so I had to look to Saturn. And so we see all this action, and all came down to Saturn, right? Like that moment in time, which we all felt, right? That's right, pre-pandemic, like just got out of eclipses. That was a very Saturnian time right then. But you can see that there are these chains taking place, and they're not always going to go all back to Saturn. This was one of those moments where it's like, oh my God, you know, this doesn't happen that often. But we see that there is a complexity here, right? And Saturn would be known as what is the final dispositor, because it's in its domicile. If a planetary chain ends at a domicile, that is, you know, that is the person in charge, basically. Now, if there are no planets in domicile in a chart, I have one of those charts, there's no final planet. So what happens is it just keeps going around in, you know, in a circle of a planetary chain of some sort. And so I like to look at it as like a cake analogy. And so it can be a lot easier to, like, you know, make a cake that has two ingredients, like our, say our sun in Aquarius here, that only has to look to Saturn. We have two ingredients. We have the sun and Saturn. That's it. But say we have, you know, say we had a unique situation where all 7 planets were involved in a chain, and now we have 7 ingredients, and we have to get those just right, and they have to circle back over, and maybe it just goes round and round. And so you can think about the complexity that could happen in that situation, but also all these different voices, all these different characters, all these different signs that are involved, and how that can really create a unique result, or it can create one that's rather chaotic and may not serve the purpose of what the original starting planet, whatever that archetype might be, was trying to do. So that's the thing with the dispositors and dispositor chains. All right. So where's all this going? Well, it's all going to the idea that rulership helps us get to shades of expression, and really blending. It allows us to get more details on how we blend expression together in each of our planets, in each of these archetypes that live within us. And this is the meat. This is the meat of reading a chart. So if a planet is not in its domicile, as we've talked about before, if it's not just a straight color, like look at our swatches of color here. We see variations, we see lights, we see darks, we see greens, we see purples, we see all these. Now, if it's in domicile, we are gonna get just a straight red hue. We're just gonna get a straight blue hue. That is pure, that is just its color. But if a planet's not in domicile, it gets these shades. It gets, different influences. And really, and not everybody I have yet to see a chart out there. I've seen one that's come close, but I've yet to see a chart out there that is fully all planets in domicile. And so this is what makes us unique in our own way. This is, these are how planets and signs blend together in these shades of expression. This is when we get the specifics of delineating for someone and really understanding our own character, our personality, and how it needs and wants to express itself, and the complexities and the richness that comes with this. So ask yourself, what is being blended in your own chart? Make your dispositor chain. Go put the planets, and then the planet it defers to, and the planet defers to, if you have one of those charts that do that, or if you have things in domicile, start looking about that. Look at how these expressions and these shades are created with each planet. Look how it is with Venus for relationships. Look how it is with Sun and your identity, your moon, your emotions, and that soulful self. Mars, that agenda and what it motivates you, and passion and causes you to act. Look at those areas of your life within that scope of rulership and the dispositor, and think about what that planet goes through to come to those conclusions or make those decisions through either the purity of itself in its own sign, or everything it has to defer to. And then do that with the houses too. Look at the houses. What does it have to go through in order for that house expression to be realized in one way or the other? So where can you use this? You can use this in all areas of astrological analysis. You can use it in natal chart delineation, as we just were talking about. You can use this in progressions, or arcs, solar arcs, or perfections, very useful timing tool. You can use this in transits and looking at just mundane forecasting, which I love to do. It's my specialty of mine, is mundane astrology. And there's so much to be said about following those rulerships and those dispositor chains and all that. And also in electional and horary work. So this is, once again, a meat and potatoes approach to getting really good at astrology, and why if you're not using it, it needs to be in your pocket. So just a quick recap: planets and houses have rulers, aka lords or hosts, and this relationship modifies the planet's direct ability to function and its shade of expression. And this relationship adds emphasis to the matters of the houses. So we know what's going on in those houses. And really, dignity plays a role in how natural a planet fits in its sign. How natural does it feel? How comfortable? Yet it does not show moral character, and it never will. All right, so let's look at some charts, because that's always fun, right? And so we are going to start with the Ascendant. We're going to start with the Ascendant, but you'll find me probably jumping all over the place to other planets, because we're going to see chains, and that's when the chart comes alive. That's another thing too, is as we start to see the chains and we follow the planetary rulership, all of a sudden, like let your eyes soften and your mind just absorb, because all of a sudden, intuitively, a picture can really start to paint itself. Now, with the Ascendant, obviously, this is a powerful starting point for rulership and dignities, because we can get a basic assessment of the ruling planet of a chart just by looking at the ruler of the Ascendant. Because keep in mind, it's not just planets that have rulership, the angles do too, and the house cusps, or the house whole sign house placements, depending on what house system you use. And so by looking at the ruler of the Ascendant and where it's placed by house and sign, and then maybe its chain after the fact, this is really going to emphasize the filter that the Ascendant, the personality, the mask we wear, how we drive our bus, basically, our physical characteristics. This is crucial to how we get information around that. So let's look at some charts to play with this concept. And we're going to start with mystery charts and kind of like throw some ideas. Normally I would do this live and get, some feedback from the audience, but today I'll just play around with it and you can kind of guess as we go. All right, so let's take a look at this chart. Once again, I do work in whole sign houses. So if it looks a little funny to you, that's why that's how it is. And so we have floating points of angles, just so you know. The ascendant, descendant, IC, and MC are all in kind of floating positions. So here we have a Virgo rising, right? We got a 22-degree Virgo rising for this person. And so immediately we know Virgo rules, or Mercury rules Virgo. And we want to know where Mercury is. That it would be the ruling planet to this chart. Now, when I say a ruling planet, that is very basic. Once you get into more levels of dignity and strength in chart, a ruling planet might not be as simple as that, but that's more than we will discuss today. However, it's enough to give us a lot of information straight out the gate. So if you just use this technique alone, it's always going to get you something no matter what. So where's Mercury? Well, we see Mercury over there in Aquarius, in the 6th house and retrograde. And so what color is this Virgo rising? So Virgo, we know someone who's very meticulous, very perfecting in some way, probably a strong work ethic, someone who probably works a lot and finds meaning in it. And then we have and these are just, we can probably go on for days of what a Virgo rising could be. So let your mind open up there. But Mercury over in Aquarius, so now our Virgo has some Aquarius tendency. We got earth and air together. We have manifestation capabilities with intellectual capabilities. We know that Mercury is a communicator. Mercury disseminates information. Mercury, Aquarius, Aquarius is a sign of community. It's a sign of advanced thinking and forward, kind of mental landscapes. It's a place of technology. It's a place of, like really strong thought stream. 6th house, we have another place of representing work or some sort of skill, the development of a skill or development of something someone loves. Because, I always think 6th house is the second from the 5th. And so that is when we really manifest what we love and put skill into it. Mercury's retrograde too. So, having Mercury retrograde means that retrograde is interesting because it's another point of, like, some would say debility in a chart. Like, it doesn't really help matters, but what it does is it helps that person think in a totally fresh and different way that other people aren't going to. Because retrograde is internalized. It's its own debility. Remember when we come back to debility and knowing that, yeah, it's going to have hiccups from time to time, but what does it do? It comes at it. It's innovative. It invents a different wheel, right? So here we have this Virgo Aquarius mixture. But what we also want to do too is say, because we know Mercury rules 2 signs, right? It doesn't just rule Virgo. It also rules Gemini. And so we see Gemini at the top of the chart there and where the midheaven is. So we can say about this person that the 1st and the 10th house, the first, the house of self, and the 10th house of career and reputation and achievement and, that public persona, they're really both emanating from that same place of that Mercury retrograde in Aquarius in the 6th house. So who could this be? Well, it's Steve Jobs, one of the founders of Apple, and why we have probably an iPhone. Many of us have an iPhone in our pocket, or that I am doing this presentation on an Apple computer. And so here we have an innovator and a creator of technology, right? Mercury retrograde in Aquarius. Plus Virgo rising, just being able, all those specifics. He's very focused on his work. And also he had longstanding health issues too, and passed away of pancreatic cancer. Earlier, about probably like 10 years ago now. So we're seeing all these 6th house emphases, right? So let's unpack this just a little bit more, to follow the chain, right? So here we have the ascendant and this person, their point of view, their self, their body, what's driving the bus, I would say. we're looking over at Mercury retrograde in Aquarius. Well, Mercury's not in its own sign, right? So we got the Mercury details, we got the Aquarius details, but there's more to it. And so we would follow Mercury being in Aquarius. That means we want to see where Saturn, right? Because Saturn has domicile in Aquarius. And so we come over here to Saturn in Scorpio. This is a very serious, this is an intense Saturn. You know, it adds probably to his dedication to being a workaholic. It's in the third house of communications. And this is all, you know, the computers, the phones, all that. This is where communication lives. So that, you know, Mercury is looking to this planet and the intensity around that. But Saturn's not in its own domicile either. It is, you know, in a Mars ruled sign. And so where's Mars? Well, Mars is over here in Aries at 29 degrees of Aries in its own domicile, right? Because Mars is the ruler of Aries. And so this would be Steve Jobs's final dispositor for his ascendant, is this driven 29-degree Mars in Aries, this pioneer. Nothing is going to stop this man. You know, in the eighth house of collaborations too. He had some issues with collaborations in his life. He had some inconsistency there, and that probably speaks to actually the Mercury being retrograde. Because sometimes we'll have planets that end up with a final dispositor, but themselves have their own debilitating influence. And so there can still be ups and downs, even if the consistency of the whole mission is backed, if that makes sense, if you see where I'm going with that. Another thing we can look at with Steve Jobs is he happened to be born around the time of a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, which is known as a grand conjunction, when these slower moving planets meet with one another. And people who are born with grand conjunctions can, you know, not all the time, but a lot of times be, you know, start something and be these great forces to give something to humanity or others. And Jupiter is exalted in Cancer there. Uranus is another point of, like, you know, technology, innovation, doing things differently. And Jupiter, and this is all in the 11th house here. And so he really was, you know, he's lifted up by the public. He's had the support he needed to, you know, always get his dreams, you know, his imagination, basically his strong imagination. And the 11th house is a place of hopes and dreams. He was always able to manifest those in some way, shape, or form. Like even when he had to leave Apple and when started Pixar and all that, he's still, there's deviations, but he always rose to the top in some way. So yeah, so there's we see that just right away from Steve Jobs's ascendant there in Virgo. So now let us look at another Virgo rising, right? Let's see how different, just through, you know, planetary placement, ruler of the ascendant placement, people can be. So here we have another Virgo rising over there at 19 degrees of Virgo. We've got Pluto on the ascendant. We've got Uranus on the ascendant. So we're, you know, right away, I'd say that this is probably an intense persona of some sorts. It still gets all the Virgo. It still gets all the meticulousness. It still gets that manifestation capability. It still gets, you know, like the artistry that comes with Virgo too. I think that there's some fine technicians and very skillful people that have strong Virgo placements for whatever their skill might be. Well, actually, let's look at his skill. You know, I just gave it away. It's man, but but that's pretty broad. So, all right. Well, where's Mercury? So now we find Mercury here on the descendant in Pisces. And Mercury in Pisces is a place where it is considered its detriment, right? Because Mercury has domicile in Virgo. So it's in the opposite position. but it's also considered its fall there. Remember, because Mercury does like some weird double duty. Mercury does some weird double duty in both in Pisces, just so you know. You're like, how can it be in detriment and fall? Well, it just is. But that doesn't mean there's some wonderful things that have come out of people that have Mercury in Pisces. So don't let that get to you. But all right, so here we have this Virgo energy, but with a planet that has that inconsistency, has that insecurity. It has, has to do things differently. It can be an innovator in some way. Probably is Mercury is a communicator, and it, in Pisces, this is someone who is probably very expressive emotionally, expressive creatively. Just the imagination is at the forefront. There can be this kind of otherworldly quality. There can be a very spiritual quality. When we think of Pisces, just add those Pisces characteristics to Mercury. Now, Mercury is in Pisces. So Pisces is ruled by Jupiter. And Jupiter is over there in Cancer, in an exalted position. So even though Mercury's debilitated over there in the 7th, there is that exaltation that comes with Jupiter up at the top of the chart, or not the top, but in the 11th house, there. And we see a grand trine going on between Jupiter, Neptune, and, Venus and Saturn too. Venus is exalted in Pisces as well. So there's some lovely lifted up placements here, but there's also the challenge of the direct go-to of the ascendant being in a place of detriment and fall. So who could this person be? Well, this is Kurt Cobain. And so we can definitely see how he'd fit that Pisces bill. And Pisces Virgo too, one of the things Kurt, we know his demise there, but we also know his creative genius that, being the basically one of the founders, or at least as far as the overall, public is concerned about, for the movement of grunge, he is a very unique character, and the character is the first house, right? So here we see this unique manifestation as a person, and also his career, because once again, that Virgo rising, the midheaven up at the top of the chart is ruled by Mercury too. So there's a lot to be said about a Virgo rising when who they are is tied up with who they are in the world, because the same planet is dictating that. And so there was really no one like him, right? We have a debilitated planet, Mercury in Pisces, ruling the ascendant. And so even though he had his inconsistencies, he struggled with addiction. He would have trouble showing up and having to, having emotional issues, having to pull back to be in rehab, there's inconsistency, right? Just not there. This is when we were getting that inconsistency. But his expression, his artistry, there was no one like him. You turn on the radio, you hear some Nirvana, right away, that's Kurt Cobain. And so he brought something new to music. And maybe it came through that intense emotion and that angst and that, there's a lot, and it comes probably through a relationship, because Mercury is right there on the descendant. And we know how tied up he was with his wife, Courtney Love, and the dependency there, which we can see with debilitated planets. Remember before we talked about how debilitated planets could have codependency issues or rely on another person in some way. And so a lot of people accused her of being part of his downfall, right? His depression, or maybe his reason that he would go into these depressed states or be addicted to things. So, we can kind of see that taking place. But at the same time, we have Venus exalted and Saturn right next to Venus there in Pisces. And so relationships still lifted him up, even though they were trouble for him, probably mentally. They affected his own personality and character and maybe his health in some way. There was also a sweetness to them. But if we go further, we can see Venus there rules the second house and the ninth house. And this man made a lot of money. This through his partnerships too, with forming a band and just the connections that he made there. And so he made a lot of money with an exalted second house ruler, an exalted ninth house ruler. He made a lot of money off of his publications and his output in the records that he made. And this thing that's interesting is there's more dignity going on in this chart than there is debility. We have that Venus in exalted in Pisces. We have a moon in its domicile in Cancer. We have Jupiter lifted up in exaltation, and we have Mars here in its own domicile in Scorpio and trying the sun. That's probably why he's, in the third house, he's like very, he was aggressive with his approach with music. And that's the thing too, is like, here we have the softness of Pisces and Venus and that expression. But the words, he would say very tender things and he'd be talking about tender subjects, but they would come out aggressive and yelling them at us and like hard chords and all that. And so there's that Martian energy behind that. And so, but at the end of the day, his character, the first filter that it went through was this debilitated Mercury. And so it always ended up, right? Because Mercury went to Jupiter, which went to the moon. And that was the final dispositor for Mercury there. And so it always came back to this very emotional place, which we also see with this grand trine. So very emotional character here. So that's some Kurt Cobain. We can probably go in this chart for quite some time, but let's move on. All right, let's go to a Cancer rising here. And so Cancer rising, Cancer is ruled by the moon. And so we want to look at where the moon is. And in this chart, we see, and you think of Cancer rising, immediately we might think of maybe a nurturing type. We might think of, kind of a mother, matriarch figure. These are probably the first go-tos there. But there is, there's a tenacity to Cancer. There is very family oriented, security oriented, and imaginative, creative in some way. But we look to the moon and we see the moon in the sixth house in Sagittarius. And so it's a little different, moon and Sag, there's this little more freedom. This is a little more space. This is a sixth house. They're once again back to maybe skills or some sort of health or activity there. Sagittarius can break boundaries, right? It's a Jupiter ruled sign. And that's why Sagittarius and Pisces are always like pushing the limits, because Jupiter doesn't have those limits there. And so there is something maybe pushing or over the top with that character. So if the moon's in Sagittarius, we got to look to Jupiter, because Jupiter rules Sag. And then we see Jupiter up there near the midheaven, which you'll see the midheavens floating in that ninth house zone in whole signs. And we see Jupiter in Pisces in domicile. So here's another chart where we have a domicile planet ending a chain in some way. And so here we have this blend with this personality of Cancer, Sagittarius, and Pisces. And we also see that the moon is in a trine we see the moon is in a square to Pluto. So that definitely adds some intensity around the moon and his character there. And we also see it's in a trine to Mars retrograde in Leo. And Leo and Sag both, these are very showy signs. These are signs that have a lot of character, have a lot of expression. And so maybe what we might think is a homebody or a homebody Cancer at first with that ascendant. All of a sudden, it just got a lot of fire behind it. It broke limits with the Jupiterian energy. It's doing things differently with Mars retrograde because it's a retrograde placement, so it acts in a different way. Well, let's see who this person is. Well, it's Michael Jordan. And look at him. He's up in the sky. We don't even see the reference of the floor there. He is flying high. This is the dunk master and the legendary showman of the NBA. And he is a record breaker. You know, Jupiter is going to break records. Mars retrograde is going to do them in Leo, a showy way. That is, you know, that is it's different. It's just different. So here we see that Cancer ascendant in the high flying sign of Sagittarius, you know, and that's ruled by Jupiter in domicile in Pisces near the MC. And when a planet is near the MC, that just gives it even more strength. So not only is it in its own home, but it is lifted up even more so by being on an angle. And then we see also, you know, that trine to Mars in Leo retrograde in the second house. And this man was the king of product endorsements. His career was totally tied up in endorsing his brand. You know, we still talk about Jordans in shoes and how much they hold their value. And there's just so much behind that. So he's kind of the king of product endorsements too. And like I said before, Cancer rising, it's a security signs, you know, he can probably build a lot of money from these placements here. And so I do want to note though, that even though he's very successful with his career in sports, he had a mutable moon. Mutable signs can go back and forth and transition between things. That Mars retrograde, right? It's its own debility in a sense where it has an inconsistency. And he actually retired 3 times. He tried to play baseball and that was not successful. He went back to the NBA and then had issues with his knee and couldn't play like he used to, you know, that 6th house moon. And so we see some ups and we see some downs to Michael Jordan's story here. But all we're doing is unpacking this chart ruler and where this story can take us. So let's do one more example in this. With another Cancer rising. And so, you know, we kept going back to our placements of Cancer and like who, you know, like we think of that mother right away, these sensitive signs. But we're going to see another character that's a little bit different. So where's the moon? Well, the moon's over there in Aquarius, a Saturn ruled sign. And lost my connection here. Let's go back. Saturn ruled sign in the 8th house. And so right away, I'm probably going to say that like the warmth or the maternal or the nurturing nature of the Cancer placement might get, you know, become a little more detached, a little more distant, a little more intellectual, a little more concerned maybe with money and resources, right? We know Cancer looks to security, but 8th house, you know, investments, resources, things along those lines. What's Saturn doing? Well, Saturn's over there in Virgo in the 3rd house. And Saturn, you know, Virgo is a very exacting sign, you know, the 3rd house, a communicating place. It's, you know, siblings and things along those lines and how the mind thinks and learning and, you know, all those things, communicating. And Saturn has to then look to Mercury because it's in Virgo, right? So Mercury rules Virgo. And we see Mercury over there in Leo. So now all of a sudden we got kind of like a more like regal representative, I guess is a good word for it, there. And then Mercury is then, we have to look to the sun, where the sun is in Cancer. and goes back to the moon. So this is an example of a chart where we see this looping pattern and there is no final dispositor. There is no ruling planet that we can just stop at. It goes on a chain, or at least the ascendant, right? The ruling planet of the chart and this person's personality. It goes from moon to Saturn to Mercury to sun back to moon. And it goes, it basically goes from the 8th to the 3rd to the 2nd to the 1st to the 8th. Repeat. Now add house rulerships in there and it gets more complicated, but we're not going to do that. We're not going to complicate it. So this is Leona Helmsley. And some of you might be like, who the hell is she? Well, she was an eccentric billionaire who specialized in property development and her real estate empire. And she was considered a genius in turning over property. She was also monikered, though, as the Queen of Mean. But you wouldn't think that right away from a Cancer rising, right? The Cancer rising, you would think like there's more of a nurturing personality, but this is a perfect example with looking at rulership. When you bring Aquarius and Virgo and Leo into the mix, and maybe the insecurities that come from a Cancer rising and the need for security and how that can come around. But she was mean to people, and she was known as the Queen of Mean. She was also found guilty on 33 counts of tax evasion, 8th house, right? In 1989, and she spent 4 years in prison. And she also was very eccentric in the way that we're adding to these Aquarius qualities, where she left her Maltese dog, which she named Trouble, $12 million when she passed. And so this dog had $12 million, which the judge reduced to $2 million out of like, just because. But yeah, so interesting character to say the least, right? Well, so we get a lot more, information with that moon in Aquarius ruling her ascendant. It's also interesting to know that she actually changed her name several times when she was younger, which is a very lunar 8th house quality, kind of transitioning and being one thing and being the next. And so when you think about the Queen of Mean too, she has the detached of the Aquarius, and it looks to that Saturn and Virgo, which Virgo can be very exacting, and it's got some criticism and in the 3rd house. And so and it's opposing Uranus too, right? And so she had no problem telling people things that other people were like, did she say that? And that's how she got her moniker, the Queen of Mean. And so we see more business security Cancer than we see nurturing Cancer there. Now, irony is that Mars there at the bottom of the chart in the 4th house in Libra, right? So Mars is in detriment there because, Libra was trying to connect, get along, and Mars is stirring things up. And so she ended up getting caught for the tax evasion because she had some workers. She had some contractors that were improving her home, probably Libra-ing it by adding like adornments and things like that. And she did not compensate them. And so they were the ones who started to put in an investigation about her. And that was the whole downfall, was her not being able to cooperate and do the fair thing with that Mars, and that Mars wanting more than its fair share. And that, those workers that were working on her home ended up, turning her in and starting this whole investigation. But at the same time too, the 5th house for her is Scorpio, and the 5th house rules speculation. And we know that she was a genius speculator on the real estate markets. So here we have her innovating real estate with that debilitated Mars. So could you see how it works in two regards, where like it was totally her superpower? How did she do that? But it was also her downfall. And that's some things that debilitated planets can bring forth. So she is totally an interesting character, and there's more to dive in with her chart there. So basically, if you're listening to this, I want you to look at your ascendant and where its ruler is, and go from there and get more out of that. So we're just going to look at a couple more charts before we wrap up here. Because of course, if you want to get into like the meat of a chart, you can look right away at the big three, the sun, the moon, the ascendant, to give these, heavy hitters some deeper context. And we're going to do it in a very superficial way. Actually, we're going to start by doing it just sign based, because you just saw me go through these other charts. It can be so complex with so many things that we can unpack, but there's so much we can just learn from going back to a quick sign layer and that shades of expression that I'm talking about, by just looking at signs and their characteristics and mixing those together to get a shade of some sort. So let's look at Annie Lennox, famous singer here. And so we see her ascendant in Virgo. We see her sun in Capricorn and her moon in Capricorn. So we see Virgo, Capricorn, right? With her basic energies. Well, when we start to look at rulership behind it, we see that Virgo and that ascendant is ruled by Mercury in Capricorn. So the ascendant in the personality is Virgo, Capricorn in many ways. Then we see the sun, which is in Capricorn, and we need to look to Saturn, which is in Scorpio. So that sun is Capricorn, Scorpio, basically. And the moon gives the same vibe with moon or Capricorn and Scorpio. So now we see that this person is very Capricorn, Scorpio, right? We kind of could look to that right away by seeing how much is in Capricorn. But really, we could get caught up in the Virgo, we can get caught up in some other things. But at the end of the day, this person's character, this person's individuality and ambition and identity, this person's soulful, emotional nature is all coming from a Capricorn, kind of Capricorn Scorpio place with a little bit of Virgo mixed in. We see a fifth house emphasis that's strong on creation. We see all this Capricorn energy is deflected over to Saturn in Scorpio, and Saturn in Scorpio in the third house. And she's a singer. She expresses herself through her voice. And we see Saturn in Scorpio has to look to Mars, and it's in a trine in Pisces. Once again, another very soulful, you hear her voice, it's got soul to it. It's deep. That's very Scorpio. That's very Capricorn. It's deep. It's sultry. It touches you. She sings about, very meaningful subjects. It's not frivolous in any way. Look at her eyes. Look at the intensity of her stare. And so we can just see those right away, those kind of placements, adding to Annie Lennox's character here. When before we could just say Capricorn, Virgo mixture, but we get a lot of meat from that Saturn and Scorpio that's really behind all those characters. And then that Mars and Pisces that is behind that. And really, if you go further, you get to the Jupiter in Cancer, that's exalted. And then we go back to the moon in the fifth house there. So that Saturn placement is very important. And we get there from rulership. Let's look at Christian Dior, famous designer. We see Scorpio on the ascendant. We see a sun in Aquarius. And then we see a moon in Cancer. And so here we got a very purity of expression. Aquarius, Cancer, Scorpio, which is Aquarius, Cancer, Scorpio. Because the ascendant, ruled by Mars, has Mars right next to it in Scorpio, in its domicile. The sun in Aquarius, even though it's in a detriment position, right? It's opposite from that Leo domicile placement. He has Saturn in Aquarius. So it only has to look next door to see its ruler in the same house. So there's still that Aquarius, purity. And then the moon is in domicile too. And so we see Cancer. So we see Aquarius, we see Cancer, we see Scorpio with this person. And I think this is a wonderful chart to dictate actually what planets in dignity can do, because there was an intensity of purpose to this man, and needing to do things on his own and doing them uniquely. It's very Martian, but it's very Aquarius. The imagination that just comes from that as well with the Cancer planet, and how his family was tied up in this too. And so just so you know, Dior's family had hoped that he'd be a diplomat. But Dior was very artistic. He wanted an artistic field and he wanted to be involved in art. And so to make money, he sold his fashion sketches outside his house. They're very, the Cancer and all the planets in his fourth house, right, is of home and family. He sold them outside his house for 10 cents each. And so in 1946, he actually a successful entrepreneur and who was the richest man in France, actually invited Dior to design for Philippe et Gaston, a Paris fashion house that had launched a couple decades prior, which would have been an amazing opportunity for anybody at that time that had that dream. But he said no, because he wanted to make a fresh start under his own name rather than reviving an old brand. So once again, we see these planets in domicile, that Mars, that moon, that Saturn. That's like, no, I have my own agenda. Even if this seems like, his exalted Venus over there in Pisces in the fifth house, even though he's got a nice opportunity, connections are trying to lift him up. He had a sense of purpose and he was going to do it. Now, he created the new look in 1947, where he lengthened women's hems. He added all this fabric to the skirting, which was very controversial because at that time, women had been wearing things that were rationed. They had been wearing garments that didn't have as much fabric because the war was rationing them. And so he came out with that look and people were like, what are you doing? He had a fashion show where they threw food at the models. Like there was total protest. Women were protesting, but he, and it's interesting because the sun is in detriment, right? He's still got that pushback, but he's got the strength of Saturn behind it and that Mars. And and the sun and Mars are square. And so even though he stirred that pot, that became the look for the next couple decades. Or not even a couple decades, probably about 15 years or so. But still, he changed the course of fashion history because he stuck to his own, the consistency, right? But he had the innovation of the detriment planet of the sun in Aquarius. So you can see here's a complex example of having so much dignity, but actually having something that is debilitated that helps the innovative process, but it's backed by a consistency behind it, if that makes sense. And so lastly, we'll look at Frida Kahlo, who we have the ascendant in Leo, which looks to the sun in Cancer there in the 12th house. The sun looks to the moon over there in Taurus in the 10th house, which is exalted. And then the moon looks to Venus in Gemini in the 11th house conjunct Pluto. And so here we have, so here we see a lot of mixture going on. That ascendant has a Leo Cancer, she's very self-expressive. She's very imaginative. She actually had in that nasty wreck where, it broke her body apart and she was in hospitals for a lot of her life and having to deal with pain and being behind the scenes in some way. But that's actually what helped her art career and her expression, Leo Cancer. That moon, which rules that 12th house space, has that Taurus Gemini energy of manifesting, of producing, of a lot of ideas that come from that and that Venusian quality. The sun, we have Cancer and Taurus together. And this is like, that's form to me, having water and earth together and all that imagination and that lifted up exalted moon. And so it's interesting because even though she was behind the scenes, had to do a lot of things from her hospital bed and even her husband, Diego, represented her. that expression was still lifted up in the public, like even though she didn't have control over it, which is very a 12th house placement. But one of the things that was most difficult in her relationship or in her life was actually her relationship with Diego. And one of the biggest disappointments was around around his affair with her sister. And so we see, if we look over the descendant and the being ruled by Saturn, and Saturn over there in Pisces, there's like some fishy boundaries going on there, and claiming her work and getting paid for her work, that 8th house position there. But if we look back, I guess what I'm saying, because we can look with relationships too, just to Venus, what partnering is going on here. And we see Venus in Gemini conjunct Pluto, and it's ruling that moon. So even though that moon's lifted up and exalted and praised in the public, there was a lot that going on behind the scenes that was back and forth. They both cheated on each other repeatedly. And one of the biggest disappointments of her relationship was when he cheated on her with her sister. And you see here's a ruling example of the 3rd house of siblings, which is Libra for her, and being ruled, by that Venus in Gemini on Pluto, and which looks to Mercury in Leo, which comes back to the sun here in the 12th house, and that Neptune and that deception, and then over to the moon, and then repeat the pattern here. So we see a lot of complexity with Frida's chart, where we didn't see, like before, maybe the consistency with some other people's chart. There's a lot of back and forth. There is a lot of, there's some ups and there's some downs. There's being dependent on other people in some way, being lifted up in other ways. And so, yeah, so there's a lot to say. There's so much to say about this chart. It's hard to get, I was trying to be very simple, but it is Neptune territory right now. Mercury stationing as I'm making this presentation, and my mind is getting carried away. But I do hope that you've gotten something out of what I've shared here today, and it opens your mind to just a whole way of that you can look at rulership in charts and those chains that we can make, and how your imagination can open and flow with that process to get those shades of expression that I'm talking about. And really, if I had any takeaway from here today, it's really about reminding ourselves that dignity and debility are not morality judgments. And that if you have a debilitated planet, that doesn't mean that that planet's bad or it's doing you disservice. It can give you wonderful things. You just have to approach it in a different way. So if there's anything you take today, it's probably those 2 slides that I just did on debility and dignity, and working those concepts into your delineations so that you can empower people and empower yourself and know where you have strength and know where there can be some dips and curves in the road, and work those to your best advantage, because I think that's where you can find, your superpower within it all, and your shades of expression. So thank you everyone for tuning in today. And I really enjoyed presenting this. And if you, this is what I wanted to say. If you want to find me, you can find me over at energeticprinciples.com. And I host a podcast called Energetic Principles Podcast, which you can find on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Spotify. And I have a recent episode out with Shu Yap where we discuss Gemini eclipse season. Lots going on here. I have 115 episodes, so there's plenty to choose from. And there are episodes with Stormy in them as well, if you want to come and visit them. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook at Energetic Principles too. And yeah, so I wish everyone well on your journey with astrology. And thank you again, Stormy, for creating this wonderful experience for everyone to partake in. Have a wonderful Memorial Day, and may the stars be with you.